All right, so there is me and you. And thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. I have prepared a somewhat conversational talk, so I'm happy to stop for questions if you so desire. There'll be questions at the end. And I just want to start with sort of situating this talk with UCSD. Now, I'm trained as a historian, but I'm actually starting with the present and work that I've been doing over the last few decades here in San Diego, trying to connect and reconnect San Diego with the indigenous nations that are in the county. And it's through that that I have any understanding of what I'm talking about today. And I'm not obviously speaking for any other folks. This is really from my own situation and experience. But we're beginning here at UCSD with this wonderful view. You can see it's a few years old because there are a lot of new buildings and fewer exposed parking lots, as we all know. But often now we start with a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to read two land acknowledgements. One is the acknowledgement from the Intertribal Resource Center, and it's sort of a posited general acknowledgement for the campus. It hasn't been officially adopted by the campus, but it goes like this. The UC San Diego community holds in great respect for the land and the original people of the area where our campus is located. The university is built on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of San Diego community. We acknowledge their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship. Now, this was written with by the ITRC with contributions from Kumeyaay community members. And it's a first stab at creating an official document for the campus. The one that I use on the bottom of my emails goes like this. We acknowledge the Kumeyaay people as the traditional caretakers of the land and surrounding ecoscape on which UC San Diego is built. We work here mindful and in support of indigenous peoples in this place, past, present, and emerging. Now, the discussion around these land acknowledgements with tribal members and indigenous communities and their governments, their officials, is that this is a step in the right direction, acknowledging the land that settler peoples are actually on. But it should come with an understanding of the responsibility to both the land and the people whose land it originally was, and maybe should be. And in that spirit, I'm going to just walk back from our beautiful picture here of UC San Diego to where this land comes from. And you'll see immediately that it's something of a mystery. It's a little bit shrouded in mystery. And we all know that UCSD sprung from the site of Camp Matthews. This is what Camp Matthews looked like from the air in 1953. And you can see sort of the landmarks where Myers Loop flagpole is, Gilman Drive. The Pacific Highway, original Pacific Highway actually cut through this area. Right where Ridgewalk used to be was the original Pacific Highway. So Torrey Pines was built in order to skirt the area here. And you can also see, and this is an old picture, obviously, but you can also see the way in which Camp Matthews is mapped to the built environment around UC San Diego and including UC San Diego since. So you can see this was a projection from 2005. Now, what's shrouded in a little bit of mystery is how the land got to be part of Camp Matthews, because clearly it was through the federal government given to the state, taken from Kumeyaay peoples in a set of circumstances that really haven't been fully figured out. So if you look at the map that Michael Connolly from Campo, one of the Kumeyaay bands of the Kumeyaay Nation, has drawn up, and you can see, we would be about there. This is squarely in traditional Kumeyaay territory, and there are a number of Kumeyaay villages that dot the landscape, including ones just north of us. Torrey Pines State Park actually has an earlier Kumeyaay village site. And this whole region was part of the resource use of the Kumeyaay. Now, how we get from there to Camp Matthews and the land going back to the city of San Diego is a bit of a mystery. I haven't actually had the time or prompting to go dig through that historical connection. I know that in the current expansion of the campus, San Diego has just redone its land use over UCSD's ownership in order to allow for the new building. So the mechanism by which this goes first to the federal government and then to the state of California and then to the city of San Diego and then to Camp Matthews and back to the city of San Diego is something very interesting. All right, but then think about the way in which this is situated. We're talking about the land responsibility, but clearly UC as a land grant institution and UCSD as one of the later campuses has a larger responsibility to the citizens of UC San Diego. And one would think something of a responsibility to educate and to engage with and to share research with the Kumeyaay bands that occupy the present San Diego. So from that situation, thinking through the progression, okay, somehow went backwards instead of forwards. There we go. We look at the connection, the historical connection between this land and colonial forces that shaped the land and the landscape. So the Spanish project of occupying Alta California, so we'd be kind of right, this is Concepcion there, so we're pretty close, starts in earnest in 1769. And the transformation of the land and its people from a Kumeyaay nation of sorts, distributed largely over the land from the ocean to the desert and up into the mountains, was turned into a set of missions, San Diego and the Presidio of San Diego over here. Now, as it turns out, the Kumeyaay relationship with the early Franciscan missions and Spanish government in San Diego was a tricky one. The first revolt against the Spanish happened at the original mission San Diego, which was burned down by the Kumeyaay. The establishment of the mission system in San Diego as a result was much more tenuous than it was elsewhere in coastal California. And hence we have more bands and more recognized federal tribes in the county of San Diego than in any county, in fact, in the entire country. And this is directly the result of Kumeyaay resistance and a very interesting kind of accommodation historically during that period. So we go from the Kumeyaay land and its confrontation with Spanish mission system and Spanish Bourbon government to a fragmented existence in the present. And you can see that even though I described the mission relationship as being somewhat different from the rest of California, the net result of the Spanish mission period and then the settlement of Anglo-Americans after the United States took northern Mexico, including California, in 1845 with the Treaty of Guadalupe in 1848, results in essentially the movement of indigenous communities from the coastal plain to reservations much further east. In fact, inland that non-indigenous settlers just didn't want at the time in the 1870s and the 1880s. So you have a fragmentation of the Kumeyaay Nation into 13 bands. So going from Campo up through, all of this is Kumeyaay up to San Pascual, which really was in San Pascual Valley, but that was taken over by settlers. These reservations in the north are what was called Luiseño, Payoncowichum in the Luiseño language, and Los Coyotes, which is Mountain Cuya reservation, and then Paula, which was both Luiseño or Payoncowichum and Cupeño that were moved there from the Warner Springs area. So you have this fragmentation that is the present situation. And of course, you get the feeling of how both cheek to jowl and how rural the Kumeyaay reservations are when you look at the map that shows the primary freeways in the San Diego region. All right, so we've situated ourselves. And then I guess the next stage of what I wanted to convey is that since I've been here, and I came to San Diego, in fact, on December 31st, 1992, I had been hired the July before. There really has been a very interesting, observable, palpable resurgence of Kumeyaay nation building across the region. And it's not just Kumeyaay that have done this. It's a general thing that has taken place among California Native peoples. And of course, it was kind of activated with the Red Power movement and that was during the 1970s that took place at the same time as the free speech movement, the anti-war movement, Black liberation movements. And it really began a whole generation of activists up and down the state of California. A number of the people who established institutions in the Kumeyaay area, like the Southern California Tribal Chairman Association, actually started their activism as part of the Alcatraz occupation in 1969. So this is a process that was long in coming, but by the early 1990s, it began to change the landscape of the San Diego region in terms of language, revitalization, new kind of ideas about governance, sovereignty that went beyond the government to government relationship and had to do with land and land management and the reservations here. And just to give you an example, I start in a course that I teach on Native California history. I start with a question towards the end of the course about how did Native peoples survive the 19th century? And this is at one of the courses, all the different responses that people got. And it's this kind of activism historically that saved Native California communities at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, that leads to the kinds of associations that are markers of this revitalization in the present. Some of these are statewide organizations. Some of these are serious connections to the educational institutions like CSU San Marcos and CSUMB, CSUSD. And some of these are local tribal institutions that are for culture, language revitalization, traditional aspects of culture, storytelling. The Yunkan Rincon Youth Storytellers often performs at UCSD, and we have kind of an association with them over a long period of time, as well as statewide organizations that also are about cultural traditions, reinstituting them, and also making the environment, both the social and physical environment, conducive to their continued survival. So if you think about the Basket Weavers Association, that's also about making sure there are environments where the materials that are used in making baskets can actually still be safely harvested and properly cultivated in the natural form. Now, in the Kumeyaay proper, there is another kind of transformation that's actually taking place now that is really quite interesting to watch. And that is sort of building institutions that actually become a kind of nation. Now, this isn't a nation the way we understand it as a function of a European nation state, you know, in the image of the US or the states or even municipal governments. This is really building a working governmental and sovereignty association among the 13 Kumeyaay tribes in San Diego. And the first and oldest of these associations was the Kumeyaay Cultural Repatriation Committee. Now, most of the Kumeyaay bands are fairly small, some of them small in territory, many of them relatively small in membership. And when the NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Protection Act was passed in 1990, the Kumeyaay bands felt that it was very difficult to react to the publication in public museums and collections of materials that might be subject to repatriation as individual small tribes. So they banded together, and it also prevented this kind of pairing tribes against each other in order to preserve collections by museums. Because the Kumeyaay tribes agreed to work in association. At first, they would get the inventory from the museums of things that might be associated with the Kumeyaay, and they would share them around, and they would, within that group, decide which band would pursue the repatriation request. Later on, they did it actually as a group. They meet as a group. So this is the first building block for something that goes beyond the individual tribal governments and their interests in preserving their culture traditions and land, stewarding their land, building economic processes that lessen dependency on federal funds and outside forces. And of course, the California Gaming Act and constitutional amendments in 2000 started off that as another source of tremendous power, influence, and some economic heft. But the Kumeyaay Cultural Repatriation is kind of the first leg of this new kind of building association of a resurgent Kumeyaay nation. The second one is formed quite recently, actually officially in the summer of 2020, the Kumeyaay Heritage Preservation Council. And as it says there, it's charged in protecting Kumeyaay spirituality, cultural resources, and heritage within the Aboriginal territory of the Kumeyaay people. And what it's taken on are issues of land management in Kumeyaay territory that isn't owned by Kumeyaay bands as part of a reservation. So consultations with state, municipal, local, and sometimes private interests around development of areas that are known to be important to the Kumeyaay as a group. And so they are now doing this as a group. This is another leg of this sort of nation building that seems to be, that's going on. And the third, which has a much longer history, in fact, goes back before the Kumeyaay Cultural Repatriation Committee in its inception, is what is now called Kumeyaay Community College, which is physically at Sycuan Reservation. They do their courses as extension through at Rosemont College. And they offer courses in various kinds of culture, language, Kumeyaay history, and their language courses are actually they're actually qualified for to count as A to G requirements at UCs, including UCSD, and also for the state college system. And they have been building both a group of Kumeyaay instructors, as well as extending their interest in participating in Kumeyaay history making or history telling across the region. So if you think about this, you have the Kumeyaay Cultural Repatriation Committee, you have a group, the Heritage Preservation Council, which is extending interest over land and Kumeyaay space outside the reservations, and you have a kind of educational institution which can function as a way of engaging youth and tribal members within the educational system, you know, of the state, including perhaps UCSD. Okay. One of the ways in which this growing interest, kind of sovereignty and power has come to roost is in the repatriation issues. And I'm going to just talk about the case that we had at UCSD. It was when it began in 1976 when a archaeological summer field school was conducted at what was then called the Chancellor's House, now University House, and a burial was found, and it ended 20 years later in the actual repatriation of this burial. And in the history of the repatriation itself, there is a lot of stuff to be learned about both how the outside works with the Kumeyaay, how UCSD has engaged, and kind of the difficulties and perhaps missteps in that process. But also, as we'll see at the end, the way repatriation is kind of a metaphor for something larger that's happening that I've been describing. So we began with University House, you know, built in the 50s at 9630 La Jolla Farms. Here's on one of the project maps that UCSD created. It's a location of a double burial, and there have been other things there as well, but a particular double burial that was part of a repatriation request that took a long time to resolve and was very contentious in different ways. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court. All the previous court rulings had ruled in favor of essentially the university's position of repatriation. It's not as simple as it seems, but when the Supreme Court declined to hear the case, that meant that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision, which was that UC had the right to repatriate to the Kumeyaay Cultural Repatriation Committee, and the member of the KCC was that was going to receive it was the La Posta Reservation, all the way in East County, close to the border near Manzanita and Campo. So the Supreme Court declined to hear this, and the case begins with this excavation under Professor Gail Kennedy, who was just moving from CSU Northridge to UCLA. The students were from Northridge. The proceeds, the material that was excavated actually then went to UCLA, and hence a sort of a very complicated repatriation case from the inception, since the materials had never actually physically been under the control of UCSD, even though they came out of the ground that was part of the university at the time. What was found there was a double burial, and another wrinkle that made this a particularly difficult case was that this was extremely well preserved, and when they were dated, they were about 10,000 years old. One of the earliest burials in any kind of condition like this known in North America at the time, and there have been subsequently a number of others, but still this seemed to be an important ancestral remain excavation thing from an archaeological point of view. Here's the letter in 2006 that actually asked for those remains back officially under NAGPRA. And before that, there had been this determination that even though these had been in the hands of UCLA, they were actually UCSD's property. The ancestors had been transferred back to San Diego, but had been put in the care of the Museum of Man, which also holds a number of other ancestral remains from this area and other areas. And then it had been requested by a laboratory at the Smithsonian of Dr. Owsley for study, and had been unceremoniously shipped off to the Smithsonian without really any attention paid to it. And it was actually in DC when the Kumeyaay Cultural Repatriation Committee wrote this letter, whereupon the remains were returned. They were brought to the Archaeological Center, which is at San Pasqual Valley, ironically, the place where the Kumeyaay villages had been removed to the current San Pasqual Reservation. All of this connects aspects of settler colonialism together with what's going on, and hence the metaphoric richness of this case. And in any case, this became bound up in the need to retrofit and refurbish the Chancellor's House, now University House. Here is a photograph of the remains cleverly hidden by the 3 UC professors that brought this case all the way to the Supreme Court. So, complicated system. There are plenty of reasons that UCSD had for repatriating, and ultimately UCSD decided it needed and wanted and tried to repatriate the ancestors with the opposition, as it turned out, from UC professors of archaeology. And one is the one I spoke about before, a responsibility from UCSD to educate each generation of members and leaders of Native American nations. And this is a general responsibility of any public institution. But when a land grant institution has received its lands indirectly and often unceded, as in the case of UCSD, from the very peoples whose descendants are here to be educated, there is in fact a different responsibility that comes from the kind of government to government treaty obligations that the US took on over the course of the 19th and 20th century. There is a case to be made that what UCSD has offered the tribes and what the tribes can do in utilizing that would be mutually beneficial in terms of the relationship. So there's a reason for repatriation to make those relationships possible. And clearly, and this I've seen since I've been a professor here, the repatriation case in and of itself was so well known among the Kumeyaay and related neighboring peoples that it was an impediment to attracting Native American students. I remember an early meeting with Chancellor Fox and representatives from Kumeyaay and Luceno Payokomuchum peoples, in which one of the counselors of Mesa Grande stood up and said, it's not like we don't have children that go to university, they just don't go to UCSD. and directly relating it to this case. And that was even before the case actually got moving that we're talking about. And clearly UCSD has a responsibility and a need. And it also then comes from this idea we started with the land acknowledgements for growing meaningful and useful and working relationships with Native communities. And then the practical thing at the time was they actually needed, the university needed the actual cooperation of the Kumeyaay in order to get permission under CEQA to do anything to University House. So the whole project was held up in part because of the repatriation case. Now, it's trickier to talk about the reasons against repatriation. The one obvious one that was alluded to and discussed from the very beginning of the excavation of these ancestors was that this is a human story and it would shed light on man in the New World, but also the history of the Kumeyaay and other peoples. That this is about research and academic freedom, and this is a legitimate scientific research and discovery project that shouldn't be hidebound by issues of how it's connected to a descendant people. And that in fact, it would be impossible to actually show a descendant relationship in the sort of normal meaning of that word, or shared group identity or cultural affiliation, which is the words of the NAGPRA law, over this huge span of time. And that was actually used as a way of getting around NAGPRA for a while, because the final rule for NAGPRA that actually said that unidentified ancestral peoples had to be returned to the group of most likely connection was not made public until 2010. So before that, the campus could say that these were unidentified ancestral remains, and therefore they were in a kind of limbo under NAGPRA. And ultimately, the three professors that brought this lawsuit against the university and by implication against the KCRC, the Kumeyaay Cultural Repatriation Committee, argued that this, like the Supreme Court case that had to do with the Kennewick man ancestral remains, were not Native American under the meaning of NAGPRA. And so this is a really tricky position, but underlying those reasons for not repatriating are arguments that were made at the UCSD system-wide ad hoc or advisory group, NAGPRA advisory group, which has now been reconstituted. But anyway, at the time, and these were actually arguments made about the very burial that we're talking about, but while it was still in the hands of UCLA. One of the sitting members of that committee, obviously one who had connections to the archaeological world, made this argument that, in fact, we don't know enough to make sure that we're not returning remains to a group that had wiped out the people whose remains those are, the ancestors whose remains those are. And I just want to linger over this for a moment, because the arrogance of a group of non-natives deciding who 10,000 years ago is the descending community to those bones is palpable. It's obvious from the first. But then setting up oneself as the gateway to somehow decide how the relationship actually was articulated, and using examples from genocidal histories in other parts of the world in order to make that argument, just seems to me, morally completely off the map here. So what I'm interested in talking about now, just for a few minutes, and I don't have a lot more here, is what the Kumeyaay response was, and you know, there had conversations. The university has had conversations. I've had conversations to members and members of the KCRC. But the larger issue, you know, just in terms of conception, is that the Kumeyaay were here long before any Europeans were here. We all understand and agreed upon a general map of the area that the Kumeyaay occupied, used, conserved, worked with, and that the sense of responsibility to that land and to the ancestors that were on that land is something that predates anything to do with NAGPRA or any of these legalistic kind of government-to-government relationships that are being the vehicles for action at the time of this case. So this is a demonstrable commitment and responsibility felt by Kumeyaay descendants to the people, to their ancestors who may be buried in different parts of the county or the region, but also to any ancestors that they historically had connection with, however far back they go. So it's part of the stewardship of the land, taking care of the ancestors of that land. And that their approach is quite heavily documented in origin stories and songs that are generations old, much older than the legal relationship that's set up by NAGPRA. Early Spanish accounts of the Kumeyaay, so European documentation in the 1760s and 1770s, our anthropological literature of the last century, and that this is an imperative that then is collectively expressed by the KCRC through each of the tribes' appointed representative to the committee. Now, it does bear some thought about why it took 20 years to repatriate this particular set of ancestors, particularly since there was a pragmatic financial and material interests of UC to get this done in order to get the university house back in shape, and all the other things that we've discussed. But in terms of the way the actual process worked with UCSD, there was at every official point, there was an ad hoc committee that was set up to investigate the NAGPRA request by the KCRC in 2005. There were different kinds of negotiations and conferences with KCRC representatives. But the unwillingness of the faculty at UCSD in general, who were making these decisions, to allow for Kumeyaay ways of knowing as being actually foundational to the assessment process of the case, made it very difficult for the pragmatic logistics of the case to move in anything like a efficient fashion. So the research directive of the university also, and the way that was understood and articulated by faculty and administrative actors here, often got in the way of actually thinking about how Kumeyaay might think of science and research in their own traditions and in their own stored font of knowledge. And I want to bring this back then to think about repatriation as a metaphor. And that inability to understand the ways of knowing that the Kumeyaay bring to the table, and the way it delayed and obfuscated and often tried to derail what should have been a fairly shut and dry case of returning 10,000-year-old ancestors to the people on the land at the present, or most likely have a descendant relationship of some sort, even if we will never actually know it. And the first part of this is to think about this understanding of what we think of as universal knowledge. That scientific knowledge is certainly not universal knowledge. It freezes out in the very categories that it sets up, ways of knowing that are from alternative and well set cultures and traditions. This shared identity of a Kumeyaay worldview needed a kind of interdisciplinary analysis that was never accorded to the actual evidence, even the evidence that was presented by the Kumeyaay in negotiations and consultations. And the way of knowing is all about the Kumeyaay as cultural inheritors of this ancestral population, even if we never absolutely know the historical relationship or what transpired in the millennia that preceded the Spanish and then the Anglo-Americans and everyone else settling on these lands. So I want to end with and then the Kumeyaay insistent, which gets back to the kind of nation building that's ongoing now of, taking over the ways of presenting their present past and rethinking their future in relation to non-Kumeyaay and other indigenous neighbors in this region. So I want to end with a film, which should pop up in a minute here, that was made by the Kumeyaay Cultural Repatriation Committee on the occasion of the repatriation.
Aka Penyama, Yay Han Maiha, Kofme on ya wacho, who a must. Shuhokwak Matampanwe, the church Neponyao. The pom Kwakme o ya, Nip on Yaustawar. We out. Aho Poyusa, who o wa ipa tipa mash, the Sukum Kuchat, the Sukum Kuch Mayoch, the Sukum Kusiach. Kukwafme Akakwe, send a pom equich, fishpui wide, Bill Pokunachis. Kofmech, Matawal, Squee Warch White, Nip on Yash the Warches, Chamashwam, Pakur, Wamch White, Epenya Matya Chesh Spear, Wahan, Kuknachus Mata Duamar, the Somo Mal, Nip on Yakwakur, Sesnikin Tike, Yahan.
For years, we've been in dialogue, court cases, trying to find a resolution, letting them know that we're still here, that we have a responsibility.
Over the last 100 years, ancestor remains, human remains have been desecrated and removed from our burial grounds. Hundreds and hundreds of them have been taken all across the country, and in fact, some are even in Spain. Smithsonian, Berkeley, Fields in Chicago, Museum of Man. That's not where they belong. They belong in the ground where they were placed. And we're
like Clint said, we have a responsibility for our ancestors, and we have a way of getting things done, pulling together. It's always pulling together. It seems to me that by pulling together, coming together, and acting as one, being as one, the nation benefits. It's a good lesson for the next generation to right a lot of wrongs that were done in the past. Better. Oh, it seems to me that they had to say these aren't yours. There's no relation to anybody. They're too old. You don't have to prove it to them anymore. We follow along. So yeah, I think coming together, bringing the nation together, bringing the young ones along, showing them. We have songs that talk about that. That people know what to do. They're emulating. They're doing what they did before them. So it's proof that that's what we're doing. We don't really have a ceremony for reburial. Once somebody's gone or where remains are gone, don't talk about them. They're buried. But it seems we're always cleaning up after these institutions. We're always doing their work that they're cleaning up after they get through and wreck things and decimate things. So yeah, it's a great thing that we're coming together and righting the wrongs for centuries.
So let me just end, making this metaphor kind of obvious. Both this case works to unsettle innocence, as Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang say in this really important essay that they wrote. And none of the moves that we're talking about here are, oops, sorry about that. None of the moves that we're talking about here are going to rescue settler normalcy. So the kinds of movement that we're talking about here are going to have repercussions in other areas that are preceded by the kind of story that we have here. Because as they say at the end of the video, they're coming for them. And this is ancestors, and then it's also other relations that are based on colonial norms that are probably not supportable in the not too distant future. I'll end there, take questions. I understand that people need to go. At some point I do too, but I'm happy to, you can unmute yourself and I will stop the share.